Welcome to the AmericanaMusic.com podcast with your host, Sarah Popejoy.
Today we have the pleasure of interviewing Matt Joe Gow. He's a two-time Music Victorian Award winner, New Zealand Country Music Honors, and official showcase artist of Americana Fest just this past September. He has an alt-country blend, kind of Counting Crows meets Tom Cochrane. Can you tell me a little bit about where you're from and kind of describe the town that you grew up in?
I'm from New Zealand originally. I lived there as a child. My mother was born there. My father's from England. We traveled a lot as a kid. I lived in Northern England and I lived in Syracuse, New York for a little bit, Canada. But New Zealand's probably where I spent most of my time as a child. I would say it was mainly in a place called Dunedin, which is the southeast coast of New Zealand. So that's right south of south. Bottom of the world, really. It's cold, as you can imagine, in the winter, and it's pretty cold in the summer, to be honest. But it's a beautiful town, and it's a sister city to Edinburgh in Scotland. So the street names are the same as Edinburgh, and a lot of the architecture is similar. Gothic architecture. Beautiful town on the hills. So you have some beautiful views there, and it's got a great music culture that was especially prolific in the 80s and 90s with a record label called Flying Nun that if any of your listeners have a listen to that was quite a prevalent record label.
I remember it.
Yeah, the bands, they exported across the world. It was the first time for Dunedin on a small, but it was a world stage. So people in Manchester will know, people and even in America will have some of the records from those bands. But what it meant for me was as a kid, after that, the bands had forged and it created an atmosphere where a young kid like me at 14 could go play in bars, support bands, open up for bands, rehearse in the city. It was just a good time to be a musician. I didn't really know anything else. I just thought that was what everyone did, play music, right? So I think it was great for me. And then I traveled a lot, settled in Melbourne, Australia, because there was a good music scene in my specific genre, Americana, which was called alt country back then. And I signed to a record label there in Melbourne, and that's where my career really kicked off.
Did you go to live in Australia at that point when you signed the label?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I was living there. I'd sort of been playing different places, Vancouver and England, and just touring, testing the waters, because I like traveling, I like different cultures. I came to learn that if you're assigned to a label, which was more important a decade and a half ago, it's less important now. I felt that if I was assigned to a label, the label was going to need to feel like I was part of that city, part of that culture, and wasn't going anywhere. I feel like in America and in Canada and England at the time, I talked with some labels, but they were sort of like, you're a Kiwi though, like if we're going to invest a lot of money in you, you just can go home, Whereas Australia, they have a history of claiming New Zealanders. And I say that affectionately, like Crowded House, and they claim a lot of bands and musicians. And it's, and that's great. There's a rivalry between Australia and New Zealand, but there's also a camaraderie. And I owe a lot to Australia and certainly Melbourne, that city where I've been fortunate enough to play many shows and have a wonderful fan base. And as I mentioned, at the time, signed to quite a large label that was called Liberation on Mushroom, a guy called Michael Gudinski's record label. That's what started it off for me about a long time ago now, closer to 2 decades almost.
That's cool. My brother lived in Melbourne for 9 months.
Super cool city.
Yeah, that's what he said. He really, really enjoyed it over there.
Yeah, I love it. It's kind of a home for me. It's interesting when you get to a point in your life, if you get to a point in your life where you fly into different countries and you go, oh, I'm home. But if I fly into New Zealand, I go, oh, I'm home. If I fly into Melbourne, I go, oh, I'm home. It's a cool feeling.
And so now, where's your home base?
I've been on tour for about 2 years now, right off Nashville. Couple of weeks ago, that was the end of what has been about 2 and a bit years of solid touring. So at some point during that time, I realized it was a bit ridiculous to have an apartment in Melbourne that was gathering dust and all my plants were dying. Yeah. I rented it out, and now, if I'm honest, I'm sort of no fixed abode, which is quite natural for me now. I'm used to it. Where will I call home? I'm not sure. In my career, I think I'm 5 or 6 albums in now. It's a time where I feel that I'm fortunate enough to have built a foundation in my home countries of Australia and New Zealand, and to start, as you saw in Nashville, and I was in the UK before that touring. So I'm starting to tour the Northern Hemisphere more, and with that, I think I'll probably base myself closer to those markets in the near future.
Yes, you were an official showcase artist at Americana Fest.
I was, yeah. On it.
Your album, Between Tonight and Tomorrow, came out around early last year. You also have an album with Karen Fields.
That's right, yeah, we have one album together, a duo album. album. So it's a different project. I think when Between Tonight and Tomorrow was my fourth album, I think. And by that point, I think after that, I did a live record as well in studio. So that's 5 albums there. And I think by that point, it was an opportunity to try something else for an album. And because I like collaborating, so we collaborated on a record together. And the result was a record called I Remember You, which we also toured quite extensively through New Zealand and Australia, which is why those last couple of years for me touring Between Tonight and Tomorrow and then this duo record, I think I brought out an EP called Closer to Tomorrow, which had a reprise of Between Tonight and Tomorrow, the song, which ended up being really successful, well, more successful than my other songs with, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of streams. And I'd never really had that before. And then I also brought out, as I mentioned, a live record and played some shows around that. So with all those releases, it was just constant, which is great. Yeah. It's great. But that's why now I'm taking a little break to write, because as a lot of musicians will probably tell you, it's quite hard to write when you're constantly getting ready for sound check and finding the next accommodation and things like that. So yeah, a lot of releases in that time, and there's a lot for people to listen to. And if you do anything, you might like something else because it's all different.
Yeah, I met Karen at Folk Fest this past year in Kansas City, I guess this year.
So she would have been at that like solo, and then I think the next week put up with me and we played a festival like the week after. That's what the two of us have been doing, just our solo projects and duo projects. And what you realize when you're spinning a couple plates is, oh wow, you get busy real quick. Which is great. I think we wanted that after COVID, and we were all stood down for so long. Let's take on board whatever we can.
Right.
Produced the acts. I produced that record, produced my records, writing, touring, and it's just, I was like, give me whatever you can and I'm gonna do it. So now after doing that for a few years, it's like, okay, maybe we can ease off the gas just a tiny bit and take a breath.
So you did produce both albums, yours and the duo too.
Yeah.
Tell me the difference in collaboration, your approach to those different albums, because they're different sounding.
Definitely.
Your independent album, a little more rock.
Definitely.
And the duo album, a little more country, obviously. Tell me about your approach between the two and how they differ.
Well, when it comes to producing, I've been producing since my second record, 7 years, and I work with my co-producer, Andy Pollock. He's in my band. He's been with the Matt Joe Gow, this project, since the inception. So we've sort of built a good relationship working through the records. I'm trying to say something different on each record and certainly sonically try to offer something different. So when it came to the project with Karen, there was an opportunity to obviously do something different again. I don't want it to sound like a Matt Joe Gow record, and I'm sure she didn't want it to sound Karen Fields record. So if the first obvious idea was to make it an all acoustic record, which I hadn't done before. So on that duo record, there's no electric instruments. So immediately that's going to change the sound, because on all my records, we have Telecasters and Hammond electric instruments, as most people do. So that was the first way of going, okay, we're making an all acoustic record. And that limits you in a good way in terms of production, because your arrangement, I'd gotten not lazy, but I'd become accustomed to going, right, second verse, we'll bring in a Hammond, it'll branch it, Telecaster and a little bit of gain on this, it'll branch it nicely. And you've got so many options to paint with electric instruments. The guitar alone can do 1 million things. So as you cut that out, there's this wonderful confinement that you work within, and I loved it. It was hard matching some of our natural reverb in the room and acoustic instrumentation. There's going to be a lot of bleed because we tracked it all at once. So that immediately made that record different. Obviously different being a collaboration. The songs are co-writes in comparison to my record Between Tonight and Tomorrow, which ironically is more of an acoustic album compared to my previous ones, but still it sits in that kind of, that vibe, that late 90s Whiskeytown, Jayhawks, that it's sort of cut from that cloth, which happy to grab a Telecaster and blaze a Hammond down on the second verse. So it's from that world, Between Tonight and Tomorrow, but my acoustic guitar is kind of front and center. I think on that record, I wanted to be the front with my band here and just deliver songs that sounded like they could have come from that ilk, that world of music that I grew up listening to, that I love so much. Just to touch on the record before that was called Break, Rattle and Roll, and that had been a full sort of sweeping Americana record where my voice was actually mixed down and we just had 11-piece band, and that's kind of more Springsteen 70s influence. So because I'd done that and I'd painted with all the colors of the rainbow, Between Tonight and Tomorrow was kind of stripping it back a bit, and then I Remember You, the duo, was stripping it back even more. So but I kind of stripped it back about as much as I can. So now I'm gonna pick up some electric instruments for the next one. We might go to town, but it's nice to change that right? So people don't just hear the same record over and over. I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah, yeah. I like how you kind of envision the album as a whole too.
Yeah, there's always a theme and a concept. Even lyrically, I hesitate to speak on the duo record too much because I didn't write all the records. I wrote all the lyrics. I wrote some of them, but that was very much a record about where we're from. We're both from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and whereas Between Tonight and Tomorrow is more about it encompasses themes of like life and loss and death and sort of a circle of life concept at time, because at the time of that record I was facing the loss of my mother, and who'd been a wonderful supporter. So I was confronted with her mortality, my own mortality, and I was thinking about a lot of those things. Plus I was 4 or 5 records in, so it was time to reflect and look at my journey. So I think it's a really introspective record for me, and maybe that's why it connected with quite a few people.
So you were saying that you do write all your songs, kind of a mixture, or?
Yeah, I write all my songs, yeah. I mean, I co-write for others, but I don't think on my records I have any, co-writes really with on mine. I'm not against it.
Yeah.
But I've always got such a back catalogue of songs, especially when I got held back for so long with the dreaded C word, that I just had all this material ready to go. But I write for quite a few other artists who recruit me to do so in a really authentic way. It's generally people I know, people I've toured with, people who've seen me, people who know my production.
Right.
So I started writing for other artists, and either I'm producing and writing for them or just one or the other.
How old were you when you started songwriting?
Oh, really? I started poetry really young, about 5. It was a hobby of mine. I remember I found it's like when you're kind of good at something as a kid, you sort of lean into it because you enjoy the stickers, right? You enjoy the well done. And I really liked poetry as a little kid, and I played the piano as well. I started playing piano when I was young. I didn't really put the two together into songwriting until I was about 13. I remember being at the start of high school, and I saw a band and they needed a singer, and I said, well, I'll give it a go. I started singing in that band, and then I quickly realized that as a vocalist, I didn't have enough control over what was being written for me to sing. So I picked up a guitar and thought, I'm going to write our own stuff, and I haven't looked back since. So yeah, probably 12, 13, I started writing actual songs.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you got to remember as well, it's a different world back then. Like when I was 12, of course we had video games and stuff, but I didn't have a mobile phone when I was 12. So when I got home, as I mentioned, Dunedin's really cold. So, you're not really out on the beach playing beach volleyball. You're not swanning around in a swimsuit. You're downstairs. Well, you're in your house playing guitar. Well, I was, because that was what there was to do. So it was easy for me. It was easy for me to just focus and play guitar. Yeah, and plus, as I mentioned, my mother, there were always records playing. She was massively into music. So her record collection was what inspired me. And that was what I followed, and later found bands that had obviously been influenced by her record collection, right? So she had the Big Stones and Tom Petty, and I loved all that. And then later I heard the Jayhawks and Wilco and Whiskeytown and those bands that clearly had been influenced by Springsteen and whoever else. So Dylan, right? So it was all like a sort of revealing moment, like young people are playing, so that was cool.
That is cool. We sent out a questionnaire for artists. At the end of the questionnaire, there's always, what kind of advice would you give artists just starting out, songwriters just starting out? And one of them really stuck with me, and it said, learn from your heroes' heroes. And I really like that. I was like, oh, that's a good one.
That is.
Yeah.
Good to know what influences your favorite. Yeah, definitely.
You're writing for a new album right now.
It's really early stages for me, which is good, because in the past I've always been in somewhat of a rush to get to the next thing, next stage. I'm always got a record completely ready by the time my current record comes out. But I intentionally held back on finishing songs on this last couple years touring so that I could leave them for this moment. So I'd have ideas, but I would sort of package them away so I could give them their just dues, like what they deserve, and really focus and enjoy the process. Again, I think writing in a hurry, and I feel like I'd be shortchanging my listeners.
So usually, how quickly do you write songs?
It depends. In the past, I would be considered someone somewhat of a prolific songwriter, I would write every day and have 100 songs in my back pocket that I do give to other artists. Now I try to preserve that creativity and channel it into whatever endeavor I've been assigned or have chosen to do. So if it's a song for someone who needs a song in this style, or I feel their record needs this, or my own record needs something, or I'm building out, then I will sit down as I am right now and focus and write. I've become more focused
in your creativity.
Yeah, so I will, which is interesting because I was watching a documentary recently with Warren Ellis from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds and Dirty Three. And he has a movie at the moment out called Ellis Park. He's a wonderful artist from Melbourne, Australia. And obviously Nick Cave is enormous. So Warren has this movie and reminded me more of when I was younger as well. He would just go, give me that. And he would grab a little keyboard and he would play it and he'd go, get this down, get this down. He would just constantly be ideas. And in stark contrast to that, I saw an interview with Nick Cave and he mentioned how every few years he arduously sits down and writes an album and, he has to go to work somewhat. And the two of them, the dichotomy was really interesting in the same band and how they create. And I feel like I'd moved from Warren over to where Nick is somewhat in how I write now. It's more focused, targeted, and I preserve my energy and it just channels into 10 songs, 12 songs, and there's the record. And I don't really from 100 songs anymore. Because for me, like as a producer, I tell artists to do that, to be honest, as many songs as you can. Most producers do that. And that is a good formula because you can objectively listen to their songs and pluck out 12 suggestions for the 12 best. I get it. In a world of singles, that makes sense. But I don't really write singles anymore. I don't really care about that method. What do I want to say? And these 12 songs will fit the concept. We're not just like writing 10 3.5-minute songs that are all trying to be the best song in the world. Like it's not how I write. Not that I ever really wrote like that, but certainly now if I'm writing with a theme and a concept in mind, it's more down the path of just 10, 12 songs, maybe 15. And
you think because you are more focused that like it improves the quality, or is there a difference in quality, do you notice? Or
there's a couple of reasons I do it. One, I'm a better songwriter than I was. I didn't write better songs, but I'm a better songwriter. Now, songwriting in and of itself can be a cathartic process. I was utilizing songwriting for that in my first albums. I was just bleeding all over the right? And people certainly resonated with that, and I resonate with that when I hear it in artists too. But 5, 6, you're gonna burn out. Like you don't have worries to do that. You can go back to stuff and you can, but unless your life is horrific or I hope that you can move on from that one girl breaking your heart or other. In my later years, I developed abilities to write authentically in the third person and sing about concepts and other people and put myself in those places. I guess the key is to not let your audience know when you're doing that, right? It always wants to sound like it when you went through it. Maybe you did in some, right? But there's a creative license, obviously. So, there's very honest songs on Between Tonight and Tomorrow, don't get me wrong. The Between Tonight and Tomorrow reprise was dedicated to my mother and after she passed, and that's maybe that honesty is why it connects so much with people. I don't know. But I think because I am a better songwriter than I was, and songwriting, while still is expressive, I don't use it as my one cathartic outlet anymore. So that affords me the opportunity to write about different things and just utilize the tools that I've learned and what a song best needs. It's not all about what do I want to say, what am I trying to, because on my first record, it's like I didn't expect to be signed. Some of those songs I never actually ever be heard by anyone outside of like someone, 20 people in Melbourne in a bar. So very honest record, my record, the message. That's just a diary, really. It's just like 11 songs or something like that. And they're all just first person accounts of my life at time. I just didn't know how to write in any other way. I had to develop that.
I find that interesting because how you talk about your younger self, how you approach songwriting versus now. And what a great point that is, because I can remember being young and I lived in Nashville for 10 years and, being that young songwriter who was like, oh, everything's got to come from life experience, which is like you said, unless you're having a horrible life, it's not going to all come from that. But I think maybe by expressing those feelings in your younger years of what you've been through, maybe grows your empathetic muscle for being able to understand where other people are coming from.
That empathy that allows you authentic when you're channeling your own emotions through words words and a song that may be about someone else.
Yeah.
And I can empathize with them, and you can, and so you're kind of attaching your emotions to that story about perhaps someone else, or perhaps it is, and it's never one or the other. Sometimes there's a mix. People will say, is that about you? And you can't even answer it because it's 30% about me, 40% about me, 30% is this. And there's no rules. But on the first record, it's just 100% about me, right? Like, just everything. This song, like, literally about my family, and literally about things falling apart. There's a song called Things Fall Apart. There's a song called I Let You Be, which to this day is people want me to play it at shows, which is great. So I'm thankful that my first record seems to have stood up, and that's probably because it was so honest, I guess. But as we've just discussed, I think when you improve as a songwriter, you can go there, but you don't have to go there all the time. And because that can be exhausting. If you're singing your diary every night for 2 years, like, God help you, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think, though, that sometimes once you've done the cathartic part of the song, though, it does kind of metamorphosize itself into something else of just that song.
Yeah, it really does.
Past that.
You do. You don't have to go there. That's a really interesting point. You don't have to go to the place that song was written completely 100% every time. In fact, as a songwriter, if you do, you might not make it through and you might break down, right? And I have to be careful of that, especially on that song Between Tonight and Tomorrow, because I often dedicate it to my mother, and I played that song at a funeral. So, you do have to be careful. It's not like you're not being authentic, but you can just teeter on the edge there. That's a skill in itself, right? Definitely. But there are songs that I've written for partners, women who I was once with, and I don't go straight back to that place. In fact, the song, not only do they grow and evolve in regards to how you see the lyrics. Some fans will come up and say, oh, your lyric about this. I'm like, I hadn't looked at it that way. I'm glad that that's the meaning you get. That's not what I wrote about, but I like that. Maybe I'll think about that when I sing that lyric next. And the song evolves and people get their own meaning from it, and it evolves live into, the band bring their influence. And maybe I go back and listen to that first record or second record. I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't know we even play it like that. We've changed it completely. So a recording's just a moment in time for that song. I don't even think about that as the song. That's a recording of that song at that time. The song continues. It lives in an esoteric space. It's not, it's bottled there. So because of that, as you mentioned, the meaning can change as well and evolve. And why not?
Yeah, I love that. Well, Matt, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. I've had a wonderful time talking with you about songwriting and your records and your albums. And everybody should definitely go check out Matt Joe Gow, all of his music. Between Tonight and Tomorrow, your single. I mean, I really, really did enjoy that. I listened to it quite a bit. I enjoyed it.
Appreciate it.
It's definitely got a style and vibe that I like a lot. Here's a short clip to next week's interview with Jessie Ray Smith.
And I was actually down at a bar locally, and there was this guy playing, and I was like, man. And I went over to the bartender. I said, do you know this guy? Are these original songs? And he goes, yeah, they're all original. So I went right up to him. I'm like, hey, man, if you want to come and I'll record an album for you for free. His name was Sam Chase. He's still going. He's totally active in the Bay Area. Great songwriter. He came in, and I just kind of, as always, I just took every opportunity I could to really kind of pick his brain. And the one thing he said to me that stuck was, if there's ever a moment when you think that something is not good enough, or if you wonder if people will notice, you know that it's not really quite there. It's not quite what you want, but you sort of take the lazy road and you just sort of settle. Yeah. You just said, never settle. Settling is like when you basically are just doing a huge disservice to your art. So I took that to heart, and it just forced me to kind of push through those hard moments.